They thought he would beg for help. But instead, he told the world's superpower to step aside. What made one of Africa's youngest leaders reject billions in aid for something you can't even touch? Dignity. Let me tell you what Ibrahim Traoré is doing. In Burkina Faso, agricultural projects are flourishing under his leadership. The country is witnessing a farming boom, and at the same time, he has introduced social policies that place people first. One such law ensures that any woman giving birth no longer worries about medical bills. Maternal care is now completely free. It is a recognition that mothers are the foundation of the nation. This is why many call him a great African leader, a president who acts with purpose rather than words. While Western leaders posture, Traore is building. The contrast has not gone unnoticed abroad. In New York, a shocking scene unfolded when protesters began chanting the name of Ibrahim Traoré during marches against Donald Trump. His name, carried on cardboard signs, soon became a rallying cry. Within 48 hours, he was no longer just a leader known in Burkina Faso or the Sahel. His name was echoing in the streets of the world's most powerful nation. And it wasn't random. It wasn't hype. It was the hunger of people longing for authenticity, for leadership that feels real. For Americans, especially Black communities, Traore's defiance struck a chord. When he took power in 2022, he did not make promises dripping with empty applause. He declared war on dependency, expelled French troops, rejected IMF conditions, and began building self-reliant food and transport systems. These weren't just policy moves. They were acts of defiance, a rupture from the colonial script. What people in the United States saw was not only defiance, but clarity. At a time when faith in government is collapsing, Traore's leadership offered an alternative: principle over power, dignity over compromise. That is why his words spread like wildfire online. A clip of him calmly stating, "We are not here to beg for survival. We are here to reclaim our dignity," hit TikTok like a grenade. Creators stitched it alongside videos of protests, police brutality, food insecurity, and gentrification in America. The message was unmistakable. He may stand in Africa, but he is speaking for us. Soon his image appeared in digital art, painted onto civil rights murals, and reimagined as a symbol of resistance. He had not courted the Western public. He had given no interviews. But his very silence, his refusal to play the game of PR, made him even more magnetic. Part of his appeal was also his age. In his 30s, Traore is not a career politician or billionaire oligarch. He is a soldier who rose from the ground, someone who speaks the language of the people. That authenticity crossed borders. Protesters in Los Angeles, Atlanta, and New York marched with banners of his face under words like "We remember Sankara" and "Burkina Faso rises while America sleeps." Spray-painted murals, subway stickers, and slogans like "Build like Traore" and "The revolution wears a beret" turned him into a living icon. His defiance became their defiance. His dignity became their demand. This movement did not stop at visuals. It became political. U.S. intelligence reports started noting the rise of an African military leader as a central figure in American protests. It was embarrassing for Washington. Trump's immigration bans and sanctions on African nations suddenly looked hollow when compared to Traore's example of sovereignty and order. Protesters asked sharp questions. Why punish nations striving for independence? Why fear leaders who build rather than beg? The contrast was brutal. While Trump promised greatness, Traore embodied it. By this stage, his name was no longer just known. It had become a mirror. Protesters saw in Traore not just a foreign president, but a reflection of what leadership could look like when it grows from struggle, not privilege. And that realization was powerful enough to echo far beyond Burkina Faso. He was no longer just a leader, he had become a measuring stick. A point of comparison so sharp that even centrist Democrats struggled to respond when confronted with questions from protesters. Why do we fund military bases in Africa but ignore African leaders? Why does our media obsess over coups instead of innovation? Why do we ban people from countries we destabilized ourselves? For the first time in decades, the West was being forced to look into a mirror held up by Africa. And in that reflection, its failures were impossible to deny. While Trump scrambled to control the narrative, another truth had already settled in the minds of thousands. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't only rejecting foreign control in Africa, he was exposing the hypocrisy of America. Yet this was just the beginning. What started as resistance was evolving into something even more powerful, a pan-African consciousness stretching across continents. The next phase wasn't just protest anymore. It was identity. By the time his name was shouted through megaphones and painted across protest murals, something deeper had been ignited. It wasn't happening in the White House. It was happening in the minds of the diaspora. For African Americans and first-generation immigrants, this wasn't just foreign policy. It was personal. Traore had become a bridge. For generations, Black Americans were taught that Africa was distant, chaotic, and tragic. School books highlighted famine and war. Hollywood gave images of poverty and despair. News cycles focused only on coups and conflict. The result was a psychological separation, a belief that Africa was something to pity, not something to mirror. But Traore shattered that image. Here was a young, unapologetically African leader who didn't fit any Western mold. He wasn't begging the IMF. He wasn't bowing at G7 summits. He didn't wear polished diplomatic smiles crafted by colonial schools. He wore fatigue, fire, and focus. And he spoke a language of dignity, not dependency. For the diaspora, raised on the legacies of MLK, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and Fred Hampton, Traore was something they hadn't seen in years, a reflection of Black power that didn't ask for permission. The response was immediate. In Detroit, youth groups redesigned their Black History Month workshops under the theme, From Sankara to Traore, Africa's Resistance Never Die. Young African Americans began calling themselves children of Sankara, descendants of Traore, not as metaphors, but as identity. In digital spaces, artists redrew African flags in African American color palettes, while diaspora influencers compared African governance to broken U.S. institutions. Hashtags like #ReclaimAfrica and #DiasporaToDignity trended across platforms. Suddenly, Africa wasn't framed as a place that needed saving, it was a source of strategy. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as one of the world's poorest countries, was being reframed. Now it was the nation that built 500 electric buses without foreign aid. The country that expelled French troops, yet stood strong. The land whose leader inspired protest slogans in Harlem and Houston. This was more than admiration, it was reclamation. For the diaspora, Traore wasn't just a leader. He was direction. Not nostalgia, but a mission. A chance to rebuild ties not through charity or institutions, but through shared resistance. And this resistance began to take practical form. In Chicago's South Side, a cooperative launched an urban farming project inspired by Burkina Faso's food independence model. In Brooklyn, a Pan-African film festival rebranded to showcase modern African leadership instead of recycled colonial trauma. In Atlanta, grassroots organizers started a Traore study series to explore what post-aid economics could look like in U.S. inner cities. For the first time in decades, African Americans weren't just reacting to trauma, they were borrowing strategies from strength. The ripple reached politics, too. Local candidates in Minneapolis and Oakland began citing Africa not as a victim, but as a model. One campaign went viral after declaring, "We don't need Wall Street. We need what Traore has, control over our food, energy, and land." It was a cultural pivot so profound that policymakers in Washington grew alarmed. Think tanks warned of ideological contagion, a term once reserved for Latin American revolutions. And they weren't wrong, because what was spreading was more than a protest. It was a philosophical rebellion. The question being asked was one the American elite had no answer for. If a poor, sanctioned African nation can fight for its people without apology, why can't the richest country in the world? Traore's example cracked the myth that change must be slow, polite, and always deferential to power. He didn't wait for permission. He acted. And in doing so, he awakened a generation tired of waiting. But with that inspiration came a warning. Symbolism without structure fades. If this awakening becomes just another trend, flattened into t-shirts, Instagram quotes, and slogans, it will dissolve like so many before it. That's why activists and educators are stressing the need for institutional memory. Not just to celebrate what Traore did, but to replicate how he did it. To ensure his leadership is not just admired, but applied. And so the future rests on one pressing question. Can admiration turn into application? Because if it can, this won't just be a cultural moment. It will be the start of a global shift. One where leadership is measured not by geography or wealth, but by clarity, courage, and community. One where Burkina Faso doesn't follow the world follows Burkina Faso. The protests may have begun as outrage against Trump, but they revealed something much deeper. A hunger for sovereignty, for connection, for leaders who don't sell out. And maybe, just maybe, that hunger will reshape not only American politics, but the very balance of global power.